Hi, everyone, and welcome back. I hope that you are doing well wherever you are. We are now nearing the end of this workshop series. Not quite there, but getting really close. So we are going to be going over the 9th session today, which is focusing on qualitative research, mainly the design process and how to conduct an interview and how to have really quality data come out of the work that you're doing. So if you'll just give me 1 second here to share that screen with you, we can go ahead and jump right in and start discussing that. So after we go over the initial, this session 9 on how best to design your study and how to best collect data, we will go into more depth next session, in session 10, about how to actually analyze the data that you collect, how to interpret it, and how to apply it in really meaningful ways. So here we are, session 9. It's all about research design and data collection. And I think we're going to just jump right in. So today we will be discussing kind of 4 key main ideas. One, the first being the usefulness of qualitative data. When would you want to employ a qualitative study or collect qualitative data in general? And why? Why is it useful to have that? Secondly, we'll go over some of the key factors to consider when you're trying to produce really qualitative research and results. And then we will focus pretty heavily on interviewing, how to conduct an interview, basically just some tips and tricks and kind of the basics, things to have in mind. It might kind of seem straightforward at first, but there are some really important things to include in your planning and execution of that interview. And then finally, we will touch just very briefly at the end on some of the different types of observation. As we know, observation can sometimes be used to collect qualitative data. So buckle up and we'll go ahead and get started. So at this point, I think during this workshop, you've probably seen this comic strip a few times, but just to jog your memory, it's a really good representation of the difference between quantitative and qualitative. So where quantitative relies on numbers to quantify or to describe a situation, qualitative research is much more open-ended, open-formed, where we use narratives, descriptions, words really to describe that situation or phenomenon. And a few weeks ago, we went over some of the major methods and techniques that are used to collect different types of data for sometimes different purposes. One of those that we went over was interviews, semi-structured interviews. And that, again, is what we will be focusing on mainly today. That's the most common way, I would say, to collect qualitative data. And then again, briefly touch on observation, but also keep in mind that there are other ways to collect qualitative information, such as a content analysis, and a few of the others that we mentioned, such as the art-based research could produce some qualitative data as well. So just know that there are different ways to collect a qualitative type of information, but we're just going to focus mainly on interviews today. So again, why would we want to use qualitative? Often we use qualitative studies to try to answer questions or understand situations where a quantitative study can't really get there, can't do the job the same way. So where quantitative studies have their weaknesses, qualitative can fill in, and vice versa. There's some other strengths as well, but it's exactly as we see in this little comic here. We can't quantify everything, and if we did try to, sometimes it wouldn't make sense. So in many cases, and we'll go over a few examples, it's just easier to get a much broader, more complex and detailed story of what's going on instead of trying to boil it down to numbers. So qualitative research can be useful for a lot of different purposes. For one, it's mostly used, or frequently used, I should say, to collect narrations, descriptions, people's understandings or interpretations of the meaning of phenomenon. So it could be the meaning of events. This could be information about their feelings towards something, or just rich descriptions of interactions or activities, different situations, some cultural phenomenon. They could be describing their personal experiences, or describing their concepts or ideas about a concept. In general, just social phenomenon. And sometimes maybe they're sharing their knowledge on a topic. It can be kind of nuanced to get in what's the difference between knowledge and perception. But in general, you're collecting individuals' interpretations of whatever it may be, a range of events, activities, situations. It can be quite broad. Hopefully you're getting that. It can be applied for, in general, just to get some sort of very detailed understanding of a social process from the people on the ground that are experiencing that social process in some way or another. And you might be able to understand, for example, what are the factors influencing that social process? What are the factors that may be causing it, or what is it producing? What are all the variables intertwined in that process, and really have a detailed understanding of what's going on there. And then at the end here, two of the biggest strengths of qualitative research is that it allows for flexibility and depth. So when I say depth, I just mean the richness of the data, or the richness of the understanding that can come from a qualitative research. You get so much detail about the experience of the individuals, or the complexity of the social process or context, in a way that a quantitative survey, for example, just really can't get at. Those surveys, they're designed to be pretty large scale. They're designed to be relatively short, and they already present you with a short list of answers that you can provide. So they're pretty strict in what type of information you can collect from them and how much information you can collect from a survey. Although they're very useful, that's just not their strength, richness of data. So quantitative surveys sometimes can sacrifice the depth or detail that they can get with each of the questions that are posed and the responses that are given. Whereas qualitative studies, as hopefully it's very clear, are much more open-ended. So it's less likely that you'll miss the nuance or complexities of the social processes that you're studying. Most of the time you're examining a much smaller sample size, so you can get really deep into each case, whereas a survey is designed to be pretty representative of a huge population. It has to be short, and it has to be succinct with pre-specified answers. And then quickly here on flexibility, we'll go into, when we get into the interview section, I think you'll see how the data collection process itself can be very flexible. There is ways to, if it fits your research design, to adapt as you go to make sure that you, the interviewer, and your questions and your data collection tools are most appropriately fitting the context in which you are operating. And then also, not only the data collection methods, but the data that you collect is a bit more flexible in what you do with it, or what you can do with it. Again, you don't have these predetermined answer options that you're dealing with. You get large answers with a bunch of information, some parts that you may not have ever expected, or you may not have been looking for in the first place. So while this can complicate analysis for sure and interpretation, it also gives you so much to work with, and how you understand what's going on and maybe what you do with the results from that study. So hopefully you, as we go through these next few areas, you can start to understand or come up with some ideas of why qualitative would be useful for a topic that you would like to study. How could you use a qualitative, let's go with how could you use a qualitative approach to understand the topic or the phenomenon that you would like to study. You might be set on using a quantitative method, but just to stretch your social science methods, think about how you would do it in a qualitative way. And you might find that the topic you're trying to research is not appropriate for a qualitative method, but there may be aspects of your topic of interest that could be really well suited for a qualitative exploration. So I would recommend just giving some thought to that. So again, so some of the big trends of qualitative data is that it really stresses that in-depth investigation. And usually it does this with relatively small sample sizes. We can't go out and interview 1,000 people, so we get a small sample size and go really in-depth with each of those individuals to understand the very detailed details of their perceptions and beliefs and things like that. And to do this, we use, for the most part, a non-random or purposive sampling procedure. So we purposefully or systematically choose the people that we want to include in our qualitative study. We purposefully select them based on an idea, the notion that they have the information that we are looking for the most part. And that differs from most quantitative studies where you try to get a random representation of the community or population of interest. So the reason that, one reason that our samples are purposefully chosen is because we want to produce very rigorous research. So rigor, just as a reminder, or for those who are not familiar with this term yet, it just refers to the soundness or precision of a study in terms of the planning of it, the data collection, the analysis, the reporting, all these different phases. Is it strong? I think another way to think of this is it trustworthy? Based on all the things that you did as a researcher, did you do them well enough? Can we trust that the information coming out of your study is accurate, that you've done everything to the best of your ability, that you have rigor in your study, and that your approach is sound? And I think this is especially important in qualitative studies where, because we do have these non-random samples, it can be hard, it can be difficult to maybe generalize your results. You can't technically generalize your results beyond the individuals that you studied, but you do still want to have some significance to your study where your findings still are relevant or can extend beyond just the people that you sampled. And to do that, we can discuss that later, but you want to purposefully choose the people that you include in your study. And I think also because the relationships or the topics that we explore with a qualitative study tend to be more complex and less straightforward than what we might be examining in survey research. We have to be then extra sensitive to this need to really convince our readers or whoever receives our results that the research is rigorous and that it has been done in a trustworthy way, that we haven't just gone out and collected stories from people, but that we've done it in a really scientific, rigorous, systematic, and empirical way, that it is still science. It's not just going out and talking to people. for fun. There's maybe sometimes an idea among some researchers that qualitative research could be a softer science, or that it doesn't have much strength or weight. This is an opinion. It's not true, but being aware of this concern when other people are presented with qualitative data, they might just view it as stories. For some people, they really like to see the numbers, but what are the numbers? What are the numbers? So if we can make a really sound, trustworthy qualitative study with trustworthy results, then it's more likely to be applied. I hope that makes sense. Not that qualitative research is not rigorous, but that we need to make sure that we check all the boxes to make it rigorous. And there are several ways that we can do this. How do we produce this qualitative data? For one, as always, we need to have a very clear research question. That's always the case, but also, especially here. And then this question should be grounded in relevant literature, in existing previous knowledge. So you want to use previous knowledge or existing literature or theories, not only to come up with your questions, but also to interpret your data. In other words, your study should build upon existing knowledge and really clearly articulate how your data is related to or connected to existing theory. That way, you're not just coming into an interview, reviewing the content and basing your analysis or your interpretation solely on your own knowledge or assumptions or biases, but it's grounded in some other scientific or general knowledge. Because qualitative research is less structured than survey research, there is going to be simply more room, a little bit more room for your bias or for your personal assumptions to influence your data interpretation. It can be a very subjective process. So by grounding or connecting your analysis, your interpretation in existing knowledge and previous theories, you can help avoid this concern of researcher bias greatly, hugely affecting interpretation of the results. And along that line, we also want to make sure that our actual methods and our data collection tools and techniques are also supported by literature and also in line with best practices. So this includes using that literature or references in general to really clearly articulate and describe the concepts that you're studying, which we've talked about before, making sure it's clear what you're studying and how you're studying it, what counts as data. And then, again, we want to very thoroughly describe and explain the case selection or our sample, the participants that we've selected to give information, or the sites that we've selected, or the events, basically the cases that we've selected. These also should be driven by a very sound logic, often theoretical considerations, and they should be seeking a completeness of data rather than seeking a convenience. And again, this is to assure our readers or recipients of our data that there's a reason for why we did what we did, and that it's rigorous and it's collecting complete data. There's this last part here about investigating researcher biases. You would want to do this in any scientific study. What bias do you have as a researcher going into it? But it's especially important in qualitative data because the data that you're getting is not so straightforward. So you can't just put it into Excel and look at the numbers and say, oh, well, 30% of people believe this, 20% of people believe something slightly different, and 10% believe this. It's not so easy to break that down. Say, for example, you are doing interviews and you get 30 interviews back. As a researcher, the way that I interpret the data is going to depend on my past experiences, on my knowledge, on my values, also on my skill simply to interpret all of that information. And another person is likely to interpret something different. So there's subjectivity in the way that we analyze our qualitative data. So we cannot eliminate this. We can't eliminate the influence of the researcher's mind on the way that the data is interpreted. But what we can do is try to minimize that, or at least identify areas in our study where researcher bias or researcher identity could potentially influence our perception of the data. And one way to do this is to complete what some people call a researcher identity memo. And so a memo is like a short article or short piece, a long note that you would take. And so this technique is really just about reflecting on different aspects of your experience and different aspects of yourself that are potentially relevant to what you're studying, and then writing it down and really breaking it down and understanding it. And as you go through this process, the intention is that you can find some different insights and connections that you have to your data that, again, could cause some sort of bias or allow you to maybe provide you with an opportunity to have a great insight into the data that you're reviewing. And then it's also just really helpful to have a written record of these. You want to do this at the very beginning before you start your research design process even, or during that process before you start data collection for sure. But then also keep it with you because you'll want to review it as you start reviewing your data. So just to clarify with the word bias, that's referring to the ways that data collection or analysis can be distorted or misunderstood or influenced by the researcher's own theory or their own values or their own ideas or preconceptions of what's going on. So again, we can't eliminate these things from our mind, but we do need to identify them. So we're going to do a really quick exercise here where we actually pause up and take a moment to do that researcher identity memo. So this can help us examine things like our goals with the research, the experiences that we have, the assumptions we might have about the topic that we're studying, or different feelings we have about it, our values that might be relevant to the topic. And this is just going to help us explore how our identity is going to serve as a beneficial resource, and also how it might serve as a negative or just a challenge, a potential concern that we should be aware of. So go ahead, when we start this, just start brainstorming what in me is related to my research topic. I'm going to actually get you started with a few questions to think about, but again, whatever you think is relevant, go ahead and write that down. But here are some things to just think about. I'm going to read you a list of about 10 questions here. Okay, so 1, what are the research topics, settings, and populations that interest you? What drives your passion for your interests? What prior connections do you have to the topics or to the people or to the settings that you're interested in studying? How do you think and feel about these topics, people, settings? Do you feel that you want to prove something or change something? And if so, how do you want to change something, or what do you want to change? What do you want to prove? And I would also say, add a note about why you want to change that or why you want to prove something. And then go on maybe to write about what assumptions are you making. These might be conscious assumptions or maybe unconscious assumptions that you really have to work to find. What assumptions are you making about your topic of interest based on your previous experiences or knowledge or connections. Whose voice or perspective means the most to you and why? And what are the potential advantages and disadvantages of your beliefs and experiences for conducting research in your topic area? So please go ahead and take a few minutes to do that researcher identity memo. Again, you can rewind and pause and think about those different questions. Okay, moving on. Again, how are we going to create quality qualitative data? Definitely we want to clearly describe how we collected and how we analyzed our data. For this, again, you'll want to review the previous literature and refer to it and really convince the recipients or tell the recipients of your data what tools you use, how you collected it, all the details of how you collected it, what counts as data, what was the process of analyzing it or interpreting it, how did you make sure that you didn't have too much bias influencing the results, what strategies did you use to identify the patterns. There's a lot going on here, but we will review this in the next session. But just make sure that you're clearly describing your process to others. And then also, we want to discuss why our qualitative research is significant. So again, it's not going to be technically, statistically generalizable to a larger population, but still, you want to have some sort of value or significance that extends beyond just your study, beyond just the people that you interviewed, let's say. And we call this the transfer value of your findings. So the significance factor could be things like, why is it important for politics or different but similar cases? I think it's ultimately going to depend on what you're studying. Maybe you want to say, I'm studying this one, a sample of this ethnic group, and you can maybe extend your findings to that same ethnic group. Or maybe you're just studying a certain type of organization or business model. It's really going to depend, but you want to have some significance of your study beyond just those people and be able to clearly articulate it. And kind of also in that describe to whom would these results be useful? Why would it be significant? And then let's see, finally here, it's kind of related to your research identity, a little bit different. We want to be especially clear about the limitations of the study. Again, we do this for all research, but it's important here just to specify the limitations of your research. And because you, the researcher, are a major tool in your data collection, you'll want to include your limitations as a researcher as well, or your preparation. So, I mean, as a researcher, you're so deeply embedded in that data collection process, especially if you're doing things like interviews. So your preparation, your behavior, your approach will influence the data that you collect. So things like if you're interacting with people in a local community, are you culturally fluent? Do you know the language? Are you trained appropriately in conducting interviews? Do you have appropriate knowledge on the topic? Things like that. And also consider a bit your positionality. So this is, again, related to our researcher identity, but it's slightly different. So your positionality, we are always interacting, at least with interviews, with our subjects as researchers. So what is my position? How does it relate to that of the person that I'm interviewing, and how could this potentially influence the data? So some really clear examples of those dynamics is, for example, a man interviewing a woman? How is that dynamic going to influence the data that's collected? Again, it'll depend on the questions being asked, but maybe as a woman, I might not be comfortable sharing certain things with a man who's interviewing me, and that could influence the data. Similarly, a very wealthy person interviewing somebody in poverty, the position of me to them can influence how we interact, how that person shares information with me, and even how I interpret it, my ability to understand perhaps. So just be aware of your positionality and how it can influence the data that you collect or the way that people share information with you. So sampling, hopefully we're all familiar with what it means, what sampling means. Here in qualitative research, it's same thing. We want to be extra tuned into, maybe not extra, but still tuned into the times, the settings, the individuals that we want to purposefully select to observe or to interview, and whatever other sources of information we decide to use. It's very purposeful, non-random process here. So yeah, I'll give you a second to read this here. Again, we want to make sure that the people that we select are very deliberately or purposefully selected for the information that they can provide us, not just because it's easy for us to access them. So how do we sample for a qualitative, let's just say, interview study? So again, the participants or the cases that we do select are selected intentionally for their capacity to provide the information that's relevant to the phenomenon that we're studying. And then in general here, you want to have a sample that there's not a certain number of exactly how many cases or participants you'll want to study, but I think in general you want to have a sample where you can show enough of homogeneity, of kind of the overlap. Where are the similarities? What are these people experiencing that's the same? This gives you kind of some confidence that the conclusions that you're finding really do adequately represent kind of the average members or the average experience or the average concepts of the group that you're studying. But then you'll also want to have a sample size that does incorporate some heterogeneity or some differences that can pick out, again, those nuances or the complexities in the experiences in the spectrum. So purposeful sampling can help you to really adequately capture the range to ensure that you're getting some sort of variation of the experience. So just some things to consider there. There's not really one exact number of how many people to choose. I think some qualitative researchers will say that if you have a very focused, clear, explicit, maybe more narrow question, that kind of the rule of thumb is once you get to about 20 people, that you're no longer going to, your information will be saturated. And at that point, you're not going to get too much more new information that hasn't already been given to you by one of those people. I would recommend doing maybe a bit, that's again for a kind of a very focused, very specific research question. I think my rule of thumb that I would suggest is a bit larger than 20 for a sample size, something like 30. Other researchers will suggest something more like 50 interviews to get both that heterogeneity and some areas of homogeneity or overlap in differences to get a really good understanding of all that's going on here, the different ways that different people are experiencing something. And then also remember to keep in mind, well, I'll save that for later. We don't want to have too many interviews, essentially. Especially because, and this is what I was going to say, especially because when that information comes back, it will be so much to analyze, and it can be really time consuming and exhausting. So you might be able to conduct 100 interviews, but that's a lot of information to process. So I think anything more than 60 samples or 60 cases, 60 participants, sorry, would be really a lot. So I think 30 is, for this audience, maybe a good number to shoot for, just to give you an idea. So again, when we sample, as always, we want to first identify our sampling frame, or this is kind of like just a section of your target population from where your sample can be drawn. And then once we have this from here, we want to identify our key informants. And this is just a really fancy word to describe those people that we know have the information that we're looking for. So these are people who have very reliable access to the information that we want to know. We have a pretty good idea that their perceptions, beliefs, knowledge, ideas, etc., are relevant to what we're studying. So you as the researcher might have an idea of what your ideal key informant looks like. Maybe they work in a certain field. Maybe they have a certain position in their conservation organization. And when I say field, maybe they're a certain career. So if you're studying female farmers, it's gonna be pretty easy to find a key informant. If you have a more specific question, we're studying a specific type of person, then your key informants might be a bit more narrow. But you should have a good idea of what this person might look like, where they are going to be found. But if not, there's another way to help you to find those key informants, so those people who can give you the information that you're searching for. So often in qualitative studies, mainly interview studies, we use what's called chain referral to extend our sample to find those key informants, to find the people to include in our study as interviewees. So it's exactly what it sounds like. It's a referral to the next person. So let's say I have one interview with a key informant, a person who has that key knowledge, and I might ask them, who else do you know that would be able to answer these questions, or who has important knowledge, important insight on this topic? And that person could refer me to other people. And this can be really helpful, not just to find those next people to include in your study, but also to kind of establish a sort of relationship with them that can improve the quality of the data that you get from them. So because your reference to them is most of the time, if it's a chain referral coming from somebody else that they know, they are going to be right off the bat, immediately, more likely to trust you, because you're not at that point some random researcher who's knocking at their door, but you have been referred to them by somebody else that they know. So they feel a bit more comfortable that you're kind of in their network, and it's important to have trust, some sort of trust in any research, but especially qualitative interviews where people are kind of opening their mind or heart to you and telling you these stories. You want them to feel comfortable and trusting of you to really give you some honest answers. So that's a plus of chain referral. You might also hear this referred to as snowball sampling. And I don't know if you have snow where you are, but a snowball starts as a small ball and you roll it down a snowy hill. And as it rolls, it collects more snow and it gets larger. And so if your sample started as the snowball and you did snowball sampling, as you went through collecting data, you would get more and more people based on the referrals that you get. The reason that I tend not to use snowball sampling is because there's a bit of a flaw in that metaphor. It's nuanced, but there's a flaw in that the snowball collects everything that it rolls past. It collects leaves and sticks and dirty snow, things that you don't really want in your snowball. Whereas chain referral is a more useful metaphor, I think, because it reminds you that as the researcher, as the person with the plan, you've connected your plan to previous literature and theories and best practices, you should also be able to direct the path of the sampling that you do. So yes, ask people for referrals to get more people into your sample, but you have the ability to have some direction and decide if you do want to interact with that person that they've referred you to, because you can't just take everyone. It needs to be a very purposeful sampling, not just rolling a snowball down the hill. So you can get the referral and you can choose to act on it or not. Okay, so now we're going to really dive into the interview section of this. So just some basic things, going over your interview guide, how to probe people or how to get more information, how to have a very flexible and flowing interview. And then we're going to talk about this relationship that we as interviewers have with our interviewees, or the people that we interview, why that's so important and how we can make sure those relationships are as good as they can be. And then a bit about recording your data. So what are interviews? It's pretty straightforward. Sometimes these interviews are called in-depth interviews or semi-structured interviews. And this is where the researcher, the interviewer, has a certain topic that they're investigating, and they would like to hear the answers from that very respondent. So it's very open-ended. It's essentially a conversation, but it's a very one-sided conversation where you are asking the questions and you're listening to the answers. It's not very two-way. So the rule of thumb here is that it's kind of a 90-10 relationship where you as the researcher talk 10% of the time, and the person you're interviewing talks 90% of the time. Sometimes that may be an 80-20 relationship, but the point is that you don't talk very much. You ask good questions and are an active listener in this conversation. So when we do interviews, it's best practice to have what we refer to as an interview guide. So it's exactly what it sounds like. It's something that guides you, a document that guides you through your interview. And it kind of just is a rough plan, an agenda of the different topics and the questions that you want to cover. So because this is a semi-structured interview, it's only semi-structured. There's a bit of room for flexibility. So it's just a guide. You don't have to stick to it exactly. And we'll get into that here. On your interview guide, you also want to have very meaningful questions, as in survey research as well. You want to make sure that they're informed by the literature, that it's collecting need-to-know information. For the most part, we want to have open-ended questions here and make sure that we have space to answer. So let me kind of take a moment and go over some of these major components of the interview guide. So I have my interview guide. Let's say I have a paper interview guide. It's going to have the questions that I want to cover. For the most part, you want your guide to be relatively short. So keep in mind, you're asking mostly open-ended questions, and some people talk more than others. So the length of your interview can vary depending on what type of person you're interviewing. In general, interviews, like let's say an interview of 1 hour is a good maximum amount of time to shoot for now, probably. Sometimes interviews can run to an hour and a half, 2 hours. That would be a really long interview. On the flip side, you could also have an interview guide that's set up for maybe a 30-minute interview. So a 30-minute interview might be about 4 or 5 questions, open-ended questions, whereas an hour interview might maybe be 10 questions, and an hour and a half interview could be somewhere around 15. So you have your guide, and it helps you get through that process. It's really just a list of topics that you want to cover, and generally you'll have it organized by topics. So you'll have your different topics on the guide, and within each topic, the specific questions that you want to ask your interviewer about that topic. So it's likely most of your interviews are going to flow in a different way, and that's why this is a guide. It's not set in stone. So you might start off every interview with the same first question, but from there it can be very flexible. So let's say a good example would be that I've asked question number 3, and during my interviewee's response to question number 3, they also start talking about a topic that I was going to ask about in question 5. So this is just my guide. It might be confusing to them if I finish question 3 and ask question 4 and let them answer, and then go to question 5 and ask them about something that they were just talking about 10 minutes ago. So I have my guide, and I listen to them talking about question 3, and then I can actually jump down to question 5. And when they've finished answering, say something like, oh, you were just speaking about blah, 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 blah. And I actually have a question about that. I was wondering, what are your thoughts about blank? And go straight into question 5. So it's kind of just a rough plan. And I think here I want to bring up that as the interviewer, you should have a very strong understanding of the flow of your guide. So you don't have to have it memorized, but you do want to have a large amount of familiarity with it so that you can guide that conversation and not always be looking down, but just have it kind of as a reference point. You kind of want to take the lead in the conversation and guide it effectively and fluidly and make your interviewee feel more comfortable, like you know what you're doing. So it helps if you have an idea of all the questions on your guide, and that kind of helps you be able to jump around as well. So when you create your interview guide, you want to have these meaningful questions. So you can start off by just doing a very big brainstorming session to start thinking of some questions that you might want to include. What are the topics that you're interested in? What comes to mind? Once you've got a big list, you can start cutting it down into things that are most meaningful. And similarly with our quantitative surveys, it's best not to place those very sensitive questions at the very beginning. Kind of start easy and work your way up to the more complex studies. And in general, you do kind of want to start by establishing a background of the person that you're interviewing that's relevant to your question. Who are you? Maybe what's your profession? Kind of get to know them first in your first question, maybe two. And then go on to studying the details or the questions that are very relevant to your topic. And then get into kind of what that means to that person or their experiences with it. So you kind of want to amp up or level up as you go and start by getting to know that person that you've selected to be a part of your study. One of the points here, we have open-ended questions. This is super important for qualitative research. You want to avoid those closed-ended questions where responses might just be yes or no. It's okay to have a few of these, one or two, maybe if they're followed up with, okay, once you've said yes or no, then can you tell me more about that, give more reasoning. But for the most part, very open-ended questions, and very clear questions, and questions that stand alone as a single question that don't confuse people. So we wouldn't want to say, what do you think about the local conservation work of lions and the people doing that work? It's that's kind of two questions. Or what do you think about, tell me what your thoughts are about national parks and their importance for local communities. Separate that. You can say, what are your general thoughts about national parks? That's one question. What are your thoughts about how they affect local communities is a different question. So make sure it's one clear question. One single clear question. And then also in your guide, as the interviewer, it's kind of your job to help people answer questions too. So you might have like guiding phrases in your questions to help get their mind in the right place to answer that question. So for example, you can include phrases like, tell me about a time when you blank, 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 or think back to the beginning of your time working as a ranger in this program. What was your experience getting to know your supervisor? Please, can you walk me through the different steps, or walk me through the process of becoming a biologist in this country? So kind of guide those questions with your words and make sure it's clear what you want your interviewee to respond with. And then, let's see. I'm sorry, I'm kind of all over the place here. We'll get there in just a second. So another way that we can have a confusing question is if it's a leading question. So a leading question is one that leads people to give a certain response. It's not open-ended, it's leading in a certain direction. So definitely we want to avoid these because it can negatively influence or misrepresent the data that we are collecting. So rather than saying something like, don't you think that wildlife is annoying to have around our villages, you might say something like much more open-ended. What do you think about wildlife living near the village? That way you're not setting them up to give you a certain type of information. And then we can get into what we call probing. So a probe is something that you kind of poke a person with, or not literally, theoretically, to get more information out of them. So you may ask your first question, but want to follow up and extract more information from that person. So this could be something, a probe could be something like, can you tell me more about that? Or what else did you experience there? It can be another open-ended question, and it can also sometimes be very specific. So you might have heard them say something and you say, I heard you mention blank. Can you tell me a bit more about why that was important in your decision to blank? You can ask a very specific kind of follow-up to get them to tell you more information about what you want to know. So some of those probes are basic, just like, can you tell me more about that? Or some of them are more specific to get a specific type of detail from that person. Either way, having a good familiarity with your interview guide, it will be important to be able to come up with good probes that are appropriately timed and that make sense, that are actually designed to collect the information that you know you want. And then also a familiarity with the theory or with the knowledge, with the literature that relates to your topic. So if you have an idea or a good understanding of the concept that you're studying already, you'll be able to come up with better probes because you'll have an idea in a way of kind of maybe what results you might be expecting. So when you see some of those ideas or theories come up in the responses that people are giving you, you can probe them to get a little bit more of information in that direction and kind of start to develop the information, get more that's relevant to what you're studying. But you have to really have a good understanding of what you're studying if you want to know how to get more information about it, if that makes sense. So there is a skill to probing and to asking appropriate small questions to get more of the big information that you want. Another skill here is verifying the information that you get from your interviewees. So again, with qualitative data collection, there's more room for researcher bias or identity to influence the way that we interpret or hear our results. So it's important to sometimes check in with the people that we're studying and say, kind of really verify with them that you're hearing correctly what they're saying. Don't do this throughout the whole interview, but every now and then check in and or if you're really unsure, definitely check in and say, for example, after somebody's answered, you can say, so it sounds like what you're saying is that blank, 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 and because of that, blank. And they can say, yes, that's exactly what I was trying to say. Or they may say, actually, not quite. I think it's more so of this. So if you're not clear on something, definitely don't make the assumption or don't let that pass. Really try to stop and verify and make sure that you're understanding it correctly. And you're not misinterpreting it, or you're not leaving the possibility for misinterpretation. The other place where it's useful to do this validation or verification process is at the end of your data collection process when you're actually interpreting, analyzing data. After you've written it up, if it's possible, you might want to check with some of the people that were involved in that study and say, ask them, just verify this is the way I'm interpreting the data. Do you agree? Do you disagree? They're obviously not the researchers, so they won't have the ability to take it on totally, but it's important to have that conversation and just verify that you're interpreting their words and the experiences correctly. And then the third point here, really important thing to remember, is the ability to really be a good listener. So giving an interview can actually be a very exhausting experience for the person asking the questions too, even though you're only talking 10% of the time. The general rule of thumb is that you only do one interview per day. Because it takes so much energy to actively listen, if you do more than one, your ability to listen and stay attentive and get quality information decreases as you add more interviews during the day. If they're short interviews, 30 minutes, you might be able to do a couple in a day, but I would try not to, especially if they're longer, like you're thinking an hour. That's a lot of your energy. Also, as the interviewer, if you're listening, try not to offer advice to people or to converse with them in a way that maybe leads them to give a certain answer. Again, if you're listening well, you'll be able to ask for more details or clarification, ask for examples, things like having probes, verifying information. You have to be listening actively to find areas where you can or where you need to probe to get more information, things like that. Also, I think as the interviewer, you definitely want to be very comfortable with silence. Expect silence sometimes, where an interviewee has paused or stopped speaking. In a normal conversation, we want to fill that silence and take up the conversation, but be comfortable with just sitting back and waiting maybe for more of that answer to come out, to allow them to think more, to give them the first opportunity to fill that space before you go on. Also, here with the listening, hopefully maybe your interview guide is on paper, and you should be able to, as you go, maintain eye contact with this person, but also take notes on your interview guide. Maybe there's something you heard that you found interesting that you'd like to ask, can you tell me more about that? Just make a small note on the side of your paper about what you'd want to come back to later, so you don't have to interrupt them. Or maybe it's something you want to ask about at a later question and write down there, remember to ask about blank. You can take some light notes as you go. So another important thing here with the interviews is to make sure that the person you are interviewing is comfortable, especially if you're doing an hour-long interview. So we're going to start with informed consent. And this is something that we have discussed before, where the participants should be informed about what they are participating in so that they can fully agree to all the risks and all the benefits. We talked about this, I think, in session 1 about the ethics. You'll probably need to present them with some sort of paper form that they sign to give you permission to conduct the study, and it should include the background of what you're studying and why and what they should expect. I'm not going to go into too much detail here. We're familiar with this concept. They'll definitely be involved in the interview. And then during the beginning, you also probably want to give some sort of a refreshing, hopefully you've met this person before or interacted with them before. They have some sort of an idea of why you're there interviewing them, but still you want to give kind of an introduction of, this is again why I'm here, this is what I'm researching, this is what to expect. Basically, you're managing their expectations and you're setting their expectations, and this helps establish comfort and trust that they know what they're getting into. It also gives you some degree of transparency. So again, they are feeling more trustworthy of you and this process, and the more trust that's there, the more comfort that's there, they're more likely to give you full and honest responses, and that's better for your ability to collect meaningful and helpful data. You might also include in your introduction things like, for the expectations, that they should feel free to let you know at any time if they'd like to take a break, or if they need to go to the bathroom. Just kind of give them an idea of how an interview can be. Sometimes these people haven't participated in an interview before, and it can sometimes be a very awkward, strange interaction to have such an in-depth conversation with somebody that you probably don't know very well. So it's important that they feel comfortable. And then part of this is just general comfort. Are they sitting in a comfortable chair? Do they have, I usually bring like a snack or drinks for my interview subjects to share with them. You want to make sure there's no physical barriers around you. Basically as comfortable as possible. You are kind of playing the role of host and making sure that they, your guests, are as comfortable as they possibly can be. And we want to make sure that we establish what's referred to as rapport, or kind of building that meaningful relationship, maybe a trustworthy relationship between you and your research subject or your participant. Again, sometimes people can feel intimidated by researchers, and because of that, they might withhold thoughts or information, maybe because they don't think that's what you want to hear, or maybe they wonder if that's the wrong thing to say. So if we have a good rapport with them, they're comfortable with us, and again, still, they're going to be able to give you better information, more insightful results. And they need to feel comfortable with being honest. And so the relationships that we study as the relationships that we establish as a qualitative researcher are important for this. And it's kind of something that you want to think about in your research design process. It's not something that's on the side. You are the tool for your data collection, you, the researcher, not your paper survey. So the relationships that you establish with people will have an influence on the data that you collect. They will influence you, the researcher will influence them who's giving you the data. It's a mutually influential relationship that we have there. So think about this from the very beginning, how you contact them, how you approach them, how you interact with them. And then when you arrive to the interview, things like, how are you dressing appropriately? What's your body language like? How are you interacting with them? How are they feeling? Be very in tune with how they are feeling. How can you manage the tone of that room, or manage the tone of the interaction? Again, making sure that they feel okay. Also, I would recommend that you show very genuine interest in what they're saying to you. I always treat my interview participants as the expert in that subject, and make sure that I treat them with that respect. And I also acknowledge that not only are the interviews sometimes awkward at first for the people being interviewed, but sometimes it can be feeling awkward for the person you doing the interview as well. So just remember that interviews can be a little weird sometimes for everyone involved. It's kind of a one-sided conversation. And a lot of the comfort here can be increased by, or a lot of the quality of the results, can be increased by making sure that it's a comfortable environment, a comfortable place for sharing. Let's see here. Okay, and so kind of a final point here. Not only will you want to manage comfort levels and your relationships and the rapport that you have with your participants, but you as the interviewer, as the research data collection tool, should be very prepared to deal with some unexpected situations. So you're interacting in a very engaged and deep way with your interview subjects. Many times you might be interviewing them in their house or in their office, in their personal space. You might be asking them about sensitive topics. It's a very intimate interaction for the most part, but you probably don't have a very intimate past relationship with them. So that could be hard to share the sensitive information. And then also, sometimes just weird things happen. It's not like a survey where you can just hand it to them and take it back 5 minutes later. I think I'll give you some examples here of how these prolonged interactions with people can have unexpected things that you as the researcher need to be prepared for. You need to be able to handle these situations with grace. You need to be able to have some sort of way to logically handle the situation. So let's say, for example, you have an interview scheduled with somebody and they show up, you realize that they're going to be an hour late or 2 hours late. How do you handle that? What's your plan? What if you have to reschedule? That's a very simple, unexpected thing, but still unexpected, and you have to find your way around that. You might end up interviewing someone you might get to their house and realize that it's very noisy there. How do you handle that? Do you ask them to go outside? You are the research tool. I can't emphasize that enough. So a lot of it comes down to you, how you act, how you interact with that other person. Let's see here. A good example is one of my colleagues did an interview one time where she was asking a man something, I don't remember exactly, something about why is this conservation, why is this land so important to you? Or why is this land important to you? Something like that. Why is it meaningful? And instead of telling her exactly in words right there, he said, well, I can show you why it's meaningful to me. If you'd like to get onto this four-wheeler, which is an automobile, if you don't know, like a four-wheeled motorcycle, if you get on one and follow me up into the mountain, I'll show you. And so that was an unexpected situation, and she had to navigate that. She could have said no, that she wasn't comfortable doing that, but she said yes, and she got on the four-wheeler and followed him out, and they continued their interview out there. Another unexpected situation, another colleague of mine was giving an interview, and the woman had her child there while she was being interviewed, and the child actually got onto the researcher's lap and sat there for at least 30 minutes and was playing with her earrings during the interview. Unexpected. How do you handle that as a researcher? So just be aware that things like this are going to happen. Be prepared for them. We can't really be prepared for them, but be to the best of your ability able to navigate these situations, and just know that they will happen. Okay, so how do we actually collect this data? For the most part, you're going to want to have some sort of audio recording of the interview. It's so much information coming at you at once. You can't process it all right there sitting down. And even if you were taking notes as you were going, it's very hard to manage your interview guide, coming up with all the probes and the verifications as you go. Actively listen and also take very good detailed notes. So it's best, if you can, to just try to record the data in audio format. To do this, you need consent, and this is going to be included in your informed consent form. People need to give you permission for you to record that conversation. Some might not want it to be recorded. Others sometimes maybe feel uncomfortable. They may be okay with it, but they might feel a little shy at first with the recording device. Either way, though, they need to give permission. If you don't have the ability to record it, you can certainly take notes. You probably want to get really good at taking notes without looking at the paper, so you can maintain that eye contact and make it feel more like a conversation, not just like they're talking at you and you're writing the whole time. So avoid it if possible, but it's definitely doable. I've done it before. you lose a bit of the richness of the data, but you do get better at it as you go. Or, if possible, have a second person there to help you take notes as you do the interviewing and the listening. You'll want to use some sort of a battery operated device, one where you can see how much power is left from the beginning so it doesn't die in the middle of the conversation and you're not able to record it. If you can, you want to have 2 recording at the same time in case a technical difficulty does occur, and it minimizes the chance that you will lose that data. Again, so notes. You want to take notes on your interview guide as you go. You can, that's one way of recording data or recording observations or notes. If you can't record, you can take full pages of notes about what you're hearing as you go through the conversation. Yes, in general, you always want to be taking some sort of notes, and if possible, avoid this as your primary source of recording data. And it's important to take notes during the conversation because we will sometimes incorporate them into what we call in qualitative research memos, which we kind of touched on earlier when we did the researcher identity memo. It's like it's kind of like a journal entry or a diary writing of a long kind of summary. So we use memos, kind of like field notes, as researchers to record our a range of things. So things that you would write in your memos. Best practice is to do one written memo after each interview that you do. And in that memo, you will write things. So you might write notes about your methods or about your interview guide. Maybe you figure out that the way that you're asking the question is not making sense. Or that maybe you're noticing that people are having problems with that question, or that it's not producing the data that you wanted. Or maybe you're noticing that the interview is too long and you need to cut one of the questions out. These are methodological notes. You can put those in your memos. And as you go, it'll help you make decisions about the rest of your data collection process. And this is where kind of the flexibility of qualitative research comes in. So we can, especially in the beginning of the data collection, adapt as we go. And along that line, bouncing back a bit to the interviews and the flexibility, you will encounter times when maybe a question just doesn't make sense to somebody, or they are not answering it in the way that maybe you want them to because they're not interpreting it the way that you've intended it to be interpreted. So in the flexibility of the research, be prepared to know how to ask that question in a different way so that it makes sense to the person receiving it. So again, that's where the flexibility strength comes in with this research. Back to another thing that you want to start including in your memos is your interpretation of your conversation. So after the interview, you can start off just giving a summary of this is what we discussed. These are some of the major points that came up. These are things that were interesting to me as the researcher. These are things that are relevant to existing theory, or maybe you have some notes about these are areas that I would like to start exploring more. And you can incorporate those perhaps into the probes that you include in your future interviews. So it's essentially a way to start analyzing the data as you go. After each interview, start processing the information that you've just collected in a way. If you want to get really fancy, you can do memos before interviews as well. But in general, at least one memo after each interview is good. And then you also have these notes collected as field observations, field notes that can help you in your later analysis phase. Notes that were fresh off your mind right after you got out of that interview can help your future self as you're trying to break it all down. And then finally, we have a transcription. So this transcription is when the act of turning the audio words into text. So just writing down what you're hearing. So you have a text transcript of that interview. This is super helpful to have it as a text because you can refer to it multiple times, you can read through it, and it will be especially helpful in the analysis process, as we will touch on in the next session, just to have it in text. It can also be very time consuming, especially if you are the one doing the transcribing. It for a 1 hour interview, it can take 4 to 5 hours to transcribe it into text. So remember this as you're going and doing your interviews, that you don't have to, but it would be best to have them transcribed at the end and account for this in your plan. Sometimes you can pay other people to transcribe it for you too, but then that's also an extra expense. So as you're recording data, just have this in mind, that you'll probably want to do this later, and think about the resources involved in that process. And then finally, so if you're not able to do, or you don't want to do a whole qualitative section for a mixed methods study, you can at least include some qualitative data in your quantitative research, if that makes sense. So if you have a survey, you can include some qualitative type questions in the survey, basically open-ended questions that don't have pre-structured responses. You typically want to place these towards the end. And I would recommend giving some sort of lined section or box where you're kind of, again, managing expectations, giving your respondent an idea of what type of response you're expecting. Are you expecting a one sentence, 2-line response, or are you expecting them to give a kind of longer story? So make sure it's clear in what you're expecting from them, and you can do this by literally giving them a box to respond in. So this is really wrapping up the interview section. Those are just the basics. It's kind of just touching on some major tips and tricks and things to consider, but there's a lot more that we could go over there. So if you do have questions, or if you're thinking about doing qualitative, semi-structured interviews in your research, please let us know. If you have more questions, or would like more advice, or would like to run ideas past us. And then again, we're just going to very quickly kind of review the different types of observation. So there's kind of 3 different categories, and within each category there's 2 types. So we have structured versus unstructured observation. So structured is when the data that we are collecting is already, or can be organized into very clear groups or categories, so that when we record data, we really just check off or mark that category, which you can see the example on the clipboard that has the categories, and we can just check them off. Whereas non-structured observation, they're not looking for very specific facts or actions, but instead are collecting kind of anything or everything that's relevant in written unstructured observations. That's much more qualitative. But the challenge here is, especially with the non-structured, but with both, is that, again, there's kind of this possibility for a researcher bias to influence your interpretation of what's going on as the researcher. So you can be observing and writing down what you think is happening. In some cases, that might not be correct. So just something to be aware of as you consider your research design. Maybe there's ways to get around that, but it is a challenge. Secondly, well, I'll get into the second one on this slide, actually. So we have, now we have direct versus indirect observation. So direct observation is observing the actual behavior that you're interested in. So for example, if I'm studying how many the guests of this restaurant or this food stand recycle their products, I would, if doing direct observation, directly observe how many people are putting their items into the recycling bin. Whereas indirect observation is observing the result or the outcome of that behavior. So in that case, I would maybe look at the items in the recycling bin versus the items in the trash can and get an idea of how many people use the recycling bin. So back to that second challenge with observation is that some might argue that there's a bit of an ethical concern here because you are researching people without their consent. You're observing their behavior and taking notes or data about it. That can be a concern, but also would be followed up with the fact that the people you're observing, they are operating in a public space. Hopefully you're not observing people in a private space. So it is, at that point, it's public kind of information. But again, just something to be aware of. Then finally, we have disguised versus non-disguised observation. So as we talked about with the interviews, you are the research tool. You are the person collecting the data, and you can have a significant influence on the information that's given to you for a range of factors: your identity, your positionality, the way that you ask questions, the way that you interact with your participants, the way that you present yourself. All of these factors coming from you can influence the data that you collect. The same thing can be for observation. If people you are observing know that you are observing them, they may choose to behave in ways that are different than they would behave if you weren't there. And they may not actively choose to behave differently, but they may subconsciously or unconsciously behave in different ways, knowing that they're being watched. So disguised observation is where the subjects are completely unaware that they're being observed. So maybe let's go back to that recycling example. You might be standing off in the distance, and they cannot tell that you're watching their recycling behaviors. Whereas if it were non-disguised observation, your subjects would be aware that they're being observed. So maybe you're standing right next to the trash can and you're clearly taking observations. That would not be a very good approach because people might feel pressured to do the right thing and go to the recycling. But there are different strengths of each of those. With the non-disguised, if subjects are aware that they're being observed, in place of observing them, it might be just as useful to use a quantitative survey to collect information from them. But the strength of doing observation as well is that maybe you can follow up with a survey to get more information about what you observed, and maybe ask, why did you do this, or what were rate on a scale of 1 to 5, yada yada yada. So the non-disguised observation is an interesting one because of the influence that you as the researcher has on people, and it's would probably be more suited for lab type studies, not a field research study. Anyway, I'm going on a tangent there. So that is bringing us to the end of session 9, where we've reviewed the usefulness of qualitative data, when it's really good to use this, for example, when we want a really deep and rich understanding of a social process or a social phenomenon. We also went over how to create qualitative research that is conducted with rigor, that's trustworthy, that makes sure we've gone through logical, systematic, planning and development and data collection that's supported by previous literature, previous knowledge, best practices, theories, etc. Oopsie. And then also we kind of dove pretty deeply into interviewing. What are the best practices there and some of the pitfalls or bad practices to avoid. And then briefly at the end, just touched on observation. So again, if you have questions about any of these topics, please do reach out to us via the Facebook group or email or WhatsApp. Happy to answer your questions. This is a pretty large topic and we've just touched on it. And I do know that at some parts I was kind of all over the place. So if something is unclear, please do let us know. Otherwise, next week we will jump into the actual analysis of this data. How do we interpret it? And how do we apply the results from our qualitative study? So we're going to go over how to organize the data, how to do coding, which is the most common form of organizing themes and ideas that come out of your interviews and making connections among them. Coding the different parts of data. How do we interpret those results? Once you have all these interviews and all this information that's coming at you, different people's words and stories, how do you begin to make sense of that? And then how do you share your results with people in meaningful ways that can produce relevant and actionable steps that benefit people and conservation? So looking forward to next week. Thank you guys for tuning in here. We'll see you soon.